This is Duke University.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having us here. I think we're all very excited to talk about this film. I walked into this movie with my opinions already formed, having read too much about it, and having come to expect a certain set of ideas about how Africa comes across, especially in Hollywood films. And a lot of those ideas I was quickly, those ideas did not come to pass for the most part, but some of them did, and I have complicated and mixed feelings about this film. On the one hand, I think that the politics of representation behind it are extremely important. The fact that it has been so successful, the $1 billion mark, and all of that is also very important. As Hollywood movies about Africa go, it is a radical departure in that actual research went into this movie. And there are African voices that are represented in a Hollywood film. Granted, voices of a certain type and disposition, but voices. It is also a movie that actually engages with what the question of what the African future looks like, which to my mind is the most critical question that animates African epistemology and politics today. And this film is the first time I have ever seen that represented in an American movie. But as a historian of Africa, I had a hard time disentangling the representations that the movie presents and the realities of African history and present life that I am familiar with. If there is a clear villain in this movie, it is, as Jelani Cobb wrote in The New Yorker, history. It is not the simpering South African arms dealer who is dispatched with early in the movie, and it's not unambiguously Killmonger, who is, to my mind, the putative villain of the movie in the kind of story sense, but is also a very reasonable character. And some of the most affective and most reasonable things that are said in the movie, especially about, for example, the legacy of the Atlantic trade and enslaved Africans, comes through his mouth. So he's not really the villain either. Rather, the villain is what has happened to Africa and what has been done to Africa over the course of the last half millennium. And the movie mourns and commemorates that history. But in a funny way, it also abnegates that history by arguing that there was this one place where none of that happened, this kind of African Shangri-La. Maybe it's unfair to criticize a comic book movie for deriving its story from a comic book. But one of the things that I couldn't help thinking was, there is no shortage of real histories and presence in Africa from which you could draw a similar argument about technological acumen and egalitarianism and all of the things that Wakanda represents. Must we imagine that place? Mm-hmm. There are many places that the movie draws upon historically. There's a great film by Abosede George, who's a historian, on Inside Edition, in which he draws out the particularities of the aesthetics of the film and what comes from where. Historically, for me, the film seemed to most explicitly draw on, for example, the histories of Ethiopia, of course the only place that was never colonized in any way, and also Lesotho, which was colonized, but in a way that made its experience more like Wakanda's than any other African European territory in Africa. It's a mountainous kingdom and one that decided to throw in its lot with the British in order to protect itself from its neighbors, which has some resonances with how Wakanda seems to work. There's also a lot of historical threads that run through the movie, or things that are drawn from life. So the Jabari tribe, as it is called in the movie, is, to my mind, a very kind of realistic representation of how many African societies chose to survive over the course of the last 500 years. Rather than affiliating themselves with powerful centralized nation states that were emerging, especially in Central Africa, they chose to recede and to go into the mountains and live an independent life apart from those more centralized places. Similarly, there's the figure of the Queen Mother, who is kind of quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes. And that is a trope of African history from Ashanti to Buganda. One of the things that really rang historically false to me was the character of the CIA agent. The CIA agent with a heart of gold is a is a new archetype to me. And if you know anything about the history of the CIA in Africa, you will know that that is not, for the most part, what that relationship was like. You know, to be totally honest, there are so many other stories that are drawn from the African past that I think I would like to see as superhero movies. I would love to see a superhero movie about Ya Ashanti-Wa or Njinga Vindongo, two historical African queens who make Okoye look, you know, retiring by comparison. But I think that critique is probably unfair, and that is not what this movie is fundamentally about. I'm sure we've all read a lot of think pieces about this film. The one that I liked the most was by Namwali Serpell, who is a Zambian writer, who argued that the place that Wakanda most resembles is actually nowhere in Africa. It is the United States. And that to me was that kind of unlocked a certain way of thinking about this film. There are a lot of different pieces of evidence that you could point to that is really what it's about. The fact that Wakanda is this isolated place that has a somewhat disdainful attitude towards the rest of the world, but one that is nonetheless cut with a certain kind of pity, that seems to me to be a very American way of looking at the world. Wakanda's obsession with blood lineage and blood quanta, also very American. The fact that there are certain institutionalized and normalized forms of violence that are written into the way that the state functions. I mean, this is a place where succession disputes are settled with a physical fight. That also, to me, reads more like the United States than it does anywhere in Africa that I know. And as soon as I started thinking about the movie in that way, as a parable for American life and politics, rather than about anywhere in particular in Africa, I began to enjoy the movie a lot more, because I could kind of take off my historical critical hat and just go along with it. Maybe I'll leave it there, but I think we have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for having me. As someone who does work in visual culture, I like to go to movies often, but I oftentimes go twice. Once I go just to look at the images, just so I can really understand the camera shots, I can understand the use of color, the use of lighting, the use of sound and music, and just the ways in which people look on stage or on the screen. So I went once just to kind of look at that. And then the second time I went to the film, I went to think about the content, And as someone who does work in visual culture, I'm always excited to see the representations of Black people and people of color and queer folks on the screen. And especially so when it is by and directed and written by those individuals themselves. So I was really, really excited by this film. I was taken away by the loveliness in terms of use of color, use of the various designs and imaging that was in the film. But there were some things that really kind of spoke very odd to me. Unlike Sam, I kept thinking about Haiti. And because of the work that I do as someone who does work in the Caribbean and Haiti in particular, I kept thinking about the kind of ways in which Haiti was, perhaps I was drawing this too closely, was kind of linked in this film. And especially thinking about this idea of isolationist, the ways in which Haiti was, kind of in a way thrown to the side. But with that, I kept then thinking about the various kinds of dilemmas, various moral dilemmas that were very much part of the film. So we have someone like Killmonger, we have someone like T'Challa, who were dealing with their own issues, but at the same time, it really formed the person that they were. And then I started thinking about the kinds of images and accoutrements that they wore and what those images told us about who these individuals were. So the Panther suit, the use of color, the use of blackness, the use of darkness was very much something that I wanted to think about in relationship to the thematics of the image, and the moments in which light was very much part of the presentation and what was going on during the conversation. And one of the most important scenes for me was the moment of the Battle Royale, I would say, the Battle Royale, and where that was actually situated with cascading waters and the various kinds of towering rocks, if you will, and the various individuals who were on those rocks and the movements that they were making, the chants that they were making. So all of that spoke to me as trying to evoke a particular type of presence, but at the same time trying to give us a sense of a visual excitement, And of course, I then started thinking about the various thematics, and as someone whose work is also embedded in feminist ideology and feminist politics, I started thinking about the roles of the women and the various outfits that they wore, the moments in which whiteness was very much part of her, Shuri's presentation when she was in the tech room and she was all in white, and the various kind of African symbols that surrounded her. So I started thinking about, what is this telling us, this kind of black woman, dark-skinned black woman in a white space, in a white gown. I started wanting to think about, there's this sense of purity in science, a sense of there is no emotional attachment necessarily to the space in which she's part of. It is more about science, and I kind of like that. But then the women fighters were in these kind of incredibly beautiful outfits, but also an armed outfit, and they were red, and they were striking against the darkness of their color, of their skin tones. So, as I was saying, that took up a lot of time for me, and I'd really like us to talk about a little bit about the use of color and how it really is equated to Africa, and how we assume, and particularly what we're surrounded by right now today, how we assume a particular sense of color with Africa. But, and that richness, what does it tell us about how we then think about this particular world? And one of the last things I want to say before we move on is the use of scenery. The ways in which, when they were outdoors, it clearly looked like a set. It clearly looked like a set that was very tightly woven. One of my particular interesting scenes was when they were at the British Museum, i.e. the High Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. And it actually was the High Museum, which I thought was amazing. Which was, and one of the things that has been very much part of the museum world is actually this idea of returning African objects back. And that is, as someone who's worked in the art community, that is something that has been continues to take up the conversation. So I appreciated also the ways in which Killmonger was in this kind of stark white room surrounded by these artifacts, and that kind of particular kind of use of camera work in that shot. So I'd like us to think about some of the ways in which lighting and camera and images and color was very much wanted to evoke this idea and the tensions that clearly are part of this film, not only about moral dilemmas, but also about the idea of colonialism, imperialism, but also liberalism. Right at the end of the movie, there is a sense of, I'm going to do certain things because that's the right thing to do, but is it really? So anyway, I'll stop with that.
Hi. I have some, I guess I'll just talk about some things that are still resonating in my mind after having watched the film. And so the first, I was driving over today and I thought about how, as the least sci-fi kind of nerd person in my family, I have ended up over the years having gone to a lot of superhero movies, not necessarily because I would have chosen it, but because I'm accompanying people who want to go. And so I guess I want to start by just talking about, or just mentioning that it is really noteworthy that we have this genre film, which often has black sidekicks, often very heroic ones, but that never center blackness. And so the way in which, both aesthetically and also the narrative itself centers black characters and black stories, black narratives, and that's the driving force. In fact, I was thinking also about how the conflict in the movie is really between the characters, as one commentary that I read recently said, that it very much is about a kind of conversation between African Americans and Africans, and to have that be the engine of a Marvel movie is pretty astounding. That's one of the first things. I was also thinking, if we think about kind of historical context, recent historical context, the ways in which trends in movies about black people was going to say African American, but I would say more broadly Black people, has kind of shifted so that the actual dates are kind of fuzzy for me right now. But several years ago, right, there was the kind of long conversation about the absence of Black representation on film, Oscar So White, which was immediately followed by a string of films, especially 12 Years a Slave, which was very highly acclaimed, that seemed to be a kind of corrective, but and actually there's Selma as well, right? That was also around that time. So there's a kind of turn to historical narratives that was one kind of adjustment, but not, I think was a problematic one in a way, because in a lot of ways, what gets centered is the traumas of Black history, Black suffering, right? And so I feel like we're in a kind of next wave in that kind of Hollywood response, film industry response to grappling with these questions of representation. And I'm thinking about how recently it really feels like the movies have become this kind of gathering space. Like we used to do it in the hair salon and the barbershop and in the home and the basement. And then I guess the internet has interrupted the ways in which we have community. And so it's very interesting to me that it was like there was a wave, maybe not with the movie that won last year, Best Actor. Moonlight, thank you. Stunning film. About marginalized and disenfranchised people, but it wasn't about that.
Right.
It's all like kind of about interiority, and now we have this kind of way. So I don't think that film had the kind of like we must go, but beginning with Moonlight and its success, it seems like the next one coming up is A Wrinkle in Time. So there's a kind of energy around coming to these movies and having a conversation about ourselves through them. And so for me, it seems like the trend tends to be more towards showing a kind of diversity of representations of Blackness on screen. That's when Black excellence, like in everything from the acting, the design, the story being told, humor, right? With a Girls Trip, Wrinkle in Time, we have a different kind of superhero in the form of a Black girl. So just that's very interesting to me to think about the ways in which the industry is trying to respond to the public kind of sentiment, but we're also making use of what this industry is kind of putting out there, generating out there in interesting ways. Get Out, right, is the other one that comes to mind. I'm also thinking about the idea of Afrofuturism and the way it intersects with the superhero genre. Again, so often Blackness is seen as outside of, Black people are not the people of the future, right? And where we exist in the past is through abjection, and yet we have this kind of Afrofuturist text that kind of, first of all, projects Black people not only in the future, but at the center of future possibility, and brings African, in quotes, history along with it. It's, that kind of melange, right, of these signifiers of the historical past, the present, and the future, all kind of in the mix in the movie, I think is really interesting as a kind of gesture and as a kind of challenge to the ways in which Black people are typically imagined in the future. I kind of have touched on this. I'm sorry. The one example that I found your reading of Shuri in her tech space really interesting. And the only thing I would add to that is it seems like the murals, they remind me of graffiti. So, that kind of young energy is very much associated with her as well as the future. So just thinking again about the ways in which these signifiers are kind of woven together. The scene that always kind of just makes an impression on me is during the major car chase scene in Seoul, I guess, or Busan, I think is where they say in Korea, South Korea. But they're in the car, doing all kinds of things. And when Okoye gets on the roof of the car and she's wearing those gold high-top sneakers, which makes me think of, like this is, but she's wearing the gown and then in the beginning of the scene, the wig. So in terms of the gender narrative that's being, because all of that is in the way, right? And like those shoes are a signifier of like this woman is ready for action. And then like here, excuse me, at the driver's, at the wheel, thank you, I'm like steering wheel, driver's wheel, slams her foot on the gas pedal and she's barefoot. And it's so that kind of juxtaposition always has an impact on me. I guess I've seen it twice, but it always is like oh, remember who these people are out in the world, but where are they from, right? Like the footwear is like a signifier of that. And the fact that it's in this kind of big, many horsepower car seems significant to me. So I think the last thing that I would kind of want to put out just for conversation perhaps is that it's interesting to me, Sam, I was really interested in your last comments about how the film is much more about a kind of much more about a kind of American narrative of being in the world and relating to the world, told through, so African American, but also American, right? And so I guess I'm really just interested in the ways in which it's framed so much as a kind of conversation about, between African Americans and Africans, and yet the fact that it is a kind of fictive space seems to me to complicate that story. The fact that it is a kind of hybrid, a kind of mélange, is not just of past, present, future, but also of many different cultures. It is interesting to me. Again, it seems like it very much places it as a conversation in the film between Wakanda and through Killmonger, African Americans, about African American identity at the end of the day. Last thing about gender, just that father-son conflicts is like, that's driving it, and also generational, continuity, fracturing. And so while the women are gorgeous and powerful and at the center of the action too, it's again just striking. It makes me pause to think, mothering as an action, there is a mother, but she's not really, at least not mothering in a way that is different from the kind of, oppositional kind of battle resistance narrative that's being told primarily through the male characters. So that's interesting to me too, how we talk about the ways in which it's advancing the narrative, or the ways in which we talk about representations of Black women, and how it may in some ways be still marginalizing some aspects of the Black female experience.
I want to stay with the representation piece for a moment. I am always ambivalent about Black cultural products that outperform financially our expectations. So I am as ambivalent about the 100 million copies that Michael Jackson sells of Thriller, right, as I am Black Panther, 1 billion and above. You mentioned 12 Years a Slave, Daphne. Famously, like when it was marketed abroad, in the actual poster, you can barely find the slave.
Yes.
Brad Pitt is much more prominent because there's always been this logic that it's difficult to sell Black-themed films to an international market, and so they're very rarely marketed that way, right? How do you explain Black Panther doing as well as it's done? I mean, over 500 million in abroad. How do you explain its success given these kind of issues of representation that we've historically seen in the past?
Well, I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit. I think there are a couple of things that are at play here. I think one, and I'm not a person who has seen comic book movies or read comic books, but I think on a variety of different levels, there is a following. There is a huge, huge, huge following of people who read comic books, who go to comic book movies, who dress up as the characters. I mean, there's a whole industry of that. So I think that there is a following already built in for that. Secondly, I think there's also a desire for Black people. Black people have a desire to see themselves on television and see themselves in particular role on screen and see themselves in particular roles, and particularly if they are the ones producing, writing, etc. So I think that also has a lot to do with it. And I think that also there is a way in which there is this desire to I think Black people have always been going to films. I've always been going to movies, and I've always been supporting movies. And I think now that they see that there's something that they can actually kind of see themselves and be part of, I think that is very much part of the conversation about why this movie is doing so well. So not only the fact that there is a built-in audience, but there's also this desire to be seen on television and actually identify with. And I think the other issue for me, it's a good film. It's an interesting film. It's a good film. You know, it's fun. It's you know, you're rooting at the end. You're excited. You cry. You love it. So it's good. I mean, I think that certain films who may appeal to or want to be geared towards Black people, sometimes they're just not good films. And we know what's a good film. I mean, we know we're savvy. We know. So we'll see something like that really sucks, and we won't go. We won't go twice. We won't go 3 times. We'll probably go once and then walk out. So I think there has been a kind of downing, if you will, or dumbing, if you will, of what Black people can actually want to see on television, on screen. So I think now there's going to be another way for people to kind of stand up and say, hey, they actually want to see good film.
But $1 billion worth?
Well, you know,
and
that's
well, and I was going to say, it's not if you're talking about $1 billion in profits, then it can't possibly be only
right.
And
Absolutely.
that's where your last point, I think, matters. I feel like I'm speculating at this point, but the fact that Ryan Coogler is an auteur, you know, he's not just a director, and it seems like Hollywood or maybe these big budget action movies, they're starting to see that there's a kind of profit in taking a risk with someone whose reputation may be based on smaller films. So Thor Ragnarok is another example. I forget the name of the director from New Zealand, but again, where it's a kind of different spin at a point. Again, as the mother of 2 not teenagers anymore, like I've been going to these movies for a long time, and I don't care about them. And all of a sudden, I mean, what I mean is that I liked Spider-Man. We were talking about this yesterday. I liked Spider-Man. By the time there was a 3rd Spider-Man, I didn't care. You know? And so, except for that, like die-hard small group, relatively small group of comic book fans who will go to every movie, they've got to keep it fresh. And so it seems like they're turning not just to minority voices, but also people, like it's that, and also at the same time, thank goodness for us, they are people who are supremely talented, right? Ava DuVernay it's not a comic book film, but Wrinkle in Time, right? And so I think that it may be a convergence of the things that you're talking about at a moment where the industry is opening up a little bit to include artists who are trying to make art out of popular culture as much as that is possible.
I don't know. I share this wariness or reticence about building a politics on extremely successful, appealing works of art. And you know,
That's a difference.
I know nothing about comic books, and to be honest, before I saw this movie, I thought that it was going to be about the actual Black Panther in Africa.
We talked about that,
I was very disappointed that it wasn't, because I thought, wow, this is Hollywood taking on an actually, you know, meaningful debate. And there is a long
that was documentary.
There's a long and interesting history of the real Black Panthers in Africa. This movie does not touch anything like that. And ultimately, it is a fairly anodyne kind of movie.
Yes.
I liked it, but I left the movie theater thinking, I wish that African art and cinema received even a tenth of
Right,
the attention
right.
that Black Panther would. This has been a banner year for African filmmaking. There was a film called Félicité, a Congolese film from last year, that featured one of the most incredible performances I've ever seen by Verobea Mputu. There's a South African film called Nkeba, which is out right now, about masculinity and initiation, which is rocking South African society to its core in a way that a Hollywood film, Black Panther included, could never actually do. So, you know, I'm inclined, my hope is that people who see Black Panther will seek out those other works of art, which are harder to find, but I think have within them more liberatory potential or political potential. You know, and if you liked Black Panther, and if you liked this kind of film, there's a whole universe of African cinema that is waiting for you, and waiting for an American audience, which for the most part it has not had.
Right.
I think when you said at the end of your remarks that it's more of an American film in some ways, the way that I would kind of paraphrase that in my own way would be that it's about identity politics more than it's about liberation politics. And so the skepticism that you're expressing may be in that we're not very good at disaggregating those two things in the ways that we talk. At least the first kind of wave of responses to the film want to bind those two when in fact they're not necessarily the same.
You know, I was struck by the excitement for the film. I mean, part of it is that I'm 52 years old, so I just don't get excited about movies that way. I mean, that's just the reality. And I often know that we're also dealing with a millennial and a post-millennial generation of folks who fundamentally have not watched that much film, right? Particularly going backwards, right? So you know, Get Out is the most woke film they've ever seen, right? Because they've never seen Sankofa. There's one way to frame that. But one of the things that also strikes me about the film, this goes back to Sam's earlier point. I mean, there's a way in which that kind of Americanist focus of the film explains why a film like that gets made and gets promoted the way that it does. But also your comment, Sam, about it being about African futures, right? And thinking about Wakanda as an African future and its relationship to African Americans. Typically, when African Americans think about the value of Africa or the value of Wakanda, it's almost explicitly cultural. And it's cultural to be referenced somewhere from a millennial in the past. There's not a whole lot of conversation about what contemporary Africa can do for African Americans either now or going into the future. And it seems to me that the film actually poses that as a very important question, right? In fact, that's what Killmonger's question is, right? Wakanda has value to Black folks globally going into the future. And I don't think most African Americans have actually fundamentally ever had that conversation honestly about what that means to look to Africa for the future of Black folks as opposed to the past of Black folks.
Although, I mean, there is of course a long history of people, Afro-Americans, making their own futures on the continent. But the way in which that is usually talked about is very particular. So I'm thinking of like Stokely Carmichael in Guinea, or Nina Simone in Liberia. These stories of people going to find some kind of future.
Garvey, right.
Garvey, the most important one. And usually being kind of disappointed or disillusioned by what they find there. And this movie is, whatever it is not that, which I really liked. Like it proposes something else that is possible. And it was unclear to me what exactly that is. I think that because that so many of those thoughts were put in the mouth of Killmonger, who is this very complicated, ambiguous character, it's like, well, what are you supposed to do with that idea if it's coming from, you know, somebody who is not, at least to me, a very sympathetic character? And your point about the end of the film, that it ends in this kind of like liberal squib of a way where it's like, okay, build a community center, which is not unimportant, but
and everyone will be okay. We'll all be happy.
But that's, Yeah.
Yeah.
A tech center where you can work on your resumes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
That was one of my problems, I think. I thought the movie was I had a good time watching it, but I also, at the end of it, felt a little somewhat disappointed because the response was to many of the problems that are so much part of Black communities was, I'm going to buy these buildings and I'm going to build a community center and I'm going to have my sister teach technology to individuals who perhaps may not have breakfast in the mornings. I mean, I don't quite know. So I was really kind of a little bit disappointed by that conversation, and wanted to really have more of the kind of radical politics that Killmonger was kind of advocating, and finding a way in which we can actually think about both of them as possible, both of them as doable. You know, if we were to actually empower the Black community in different ways that were not necessarily about, establishing community centers, if you will, not that that's not important, but if there were other political ways, and of course that's a no-no. You know, Disney cannot afford that kind of conversation to actually think about the empowerment of Black people in different ways that is not a part of a neoliberal politics. I think that was definitely a no-no. And I was telling my friends at the end yesterday that I think Killmonger is alive. I don't think he's dead. You with me? She's with me. See? I'm not the only one. And you're with me too. Thank you. Because they laughed at me.
Because we don't see him die.
We don't see him. It's a long shot. We have a long shot. So
Right.
what we see is, this benevolent cousin bending over him, and we don't know, he might take him up, take him down somewhere and clean him up, put a little thing in his back, and we're all good. So I was telling my friends that I think he's still alive, and I'm waiting to see what happens, because that conversation makes it a little bit more exciting for me. If he's alive, then there's still this tension that exists between the two of them. But maybe I hope, maybe I dream. I'm an optimist.
What complicates that vision for the future, Killmonger, is that part of what makes him so problematic is that he has been corrupted in the sense that he thinks like an American, right? But what does the CIA guy say?
He's
one of ours.
Right. He's not
one of ours.
He doesn't just think like an American, right? He's trained by American Empire,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Educated in Annapolis, goes through the CIA, right?
Precisely.
MIT and all that.
Precisely.
Exactly.
So the question of the means, the methods, is so not settled.
Right.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I feel like it was a Trojan horse of a movie in the sense that Coogler made that the conversation.
When you see the overhead view of Wakanda and they're landing the spaceship, and you get some sense of the city, there are so many design questions that come up. In fact, I might argue that might be the most interesting part of the movie, at least a part of the movie that folks will be grappling with going forward, right? There are no cars
Right.
in Wakanda, right? What is happening with this elaborate subway system, right?
Yeah.
There's all why are the buildings designed the way that they are? What does that say about contemporary African architecture, right? The built environment in Africa, whether or not we're talking about the past or the future. I mean, those are very compelling questions, and questions that don't usually come up when we talk about Black films.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. No, I found that very interesting. Also, the fact that there was such a concerted effort to really design the set to incorporate the possibilities of a kind of futuristic looking Africa, where the built environment is at one time available to us, but also kind of not quite what we would imagine, but yet bringing us back to the more quaint and understanding of what we imagine an African community to look like. And I like the ways in which the set designers and the filmmakers actually wanted to play with those kinds of dichotomies, really wanting us to think about the kind of present, but also what the future would bring, But I also noticed what I found interesting, what I noticed also, in that futuristic Africa, there were no people in the spaces that were all, there was no one on the train. There was no one on the train, there was no one walking on the rails, there was, probably could get killed or whatever, but there was no people in that kind of futuristic looking Africa.
Right.
You know, no people were not actually walking in the streets, but yet they were walking in the streets of the more kind of the Africa
Traditional,
nation,
right.
the traditional that we know.
Right.
And I just thought that, so what was that about? So there was one space that was kind of open to the ideas of technological advancement, but yet the ones that we know more conventionally was crowded, was actually filled with people and things.
I hadn't noticed that, but that's interesting. And that's a
you
feature
go
of so
twice,
many,
you know?
so many utopic visions
Yes.
of cities. They're always free of people, from like Le
Absolutely.
Corbusier to this.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I noticed about the built environment question was that a lot of that seems to be pretty explicitly borrowed from the Afrofuturist movement more generally. So there's this movie Pumzi, a Kenyan film that takes place in a lab that looks a lot like the labs in this film. There's a film that I'm forgetting the name of by a filmmaker called Francis Bodomo, which is also similarly this kind of Afrotopia that is also has characteristics of a real African city. Like when they're walking around the streets, there are actually people in some streets.
Yes, yeah. But she's calling it not the city, but it's more like, it's like the downtown.
It's a traditional
Right.
marketplace.
The
It's a
traditional
traditional
market,
market.
right. There are people there walking, right.
Yeah, interesting.
But in the Afrofuture Africa, right, there weren't that many people walking, if any at all. But we saw a lot of technology.
And so the only thing I would say is that that's because a lot of it takes place in the compound where the ruling
Right.
class live. So that's why. So I think when you
Right.
notice the lack of people on the train, that's where you get the glitch in the portrait of the film, because at the very least they could take the subway.
But that opens up another, I think, interesting question, is also the kind of class separation, if you will.
Right.
So in this space that's very much open to technology, who gets to occupy that space?
Yeah.
You know, the ruling class. But then when we turn it over to the more kind of popular areas, who's in those spaces? You know, market people, individuals, you know, walking about town, doing their business. So I think there's an issue of class in this movie that that I think we can still really talk about. You know, like who gets to be part of that conversation.
Because most of the times we're in the marketplace, it's with T'Challa,
Yes.
right? And the film is making a very clear claim that he's a man of the people, which kind of in some ways obscures the very class elements that you're asking us to really pay more attention to. Well, here's to the second Black Panther. Killmonger. And we find out that Fred Hampton Sr. was Wakandan. That's what I'm holding out for.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're waiting.
He's alive, I tell you, he's alive.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.